Well, good evening. My name's Denny Smith. Welcome to the show. Sometimes it's a lot of fun to just disconnect from the news cycle, to disconnect from the hot topics and the nonsense of YouTube and Facebook, Twitter, and just reminisce a little bit. 45 years ago, a new show was beginning. The original Star Trek followed the interstellar adventures of James T. Kirk and a crew of exploration vessel of the 23rd century Galactic United Federations of Planets. It was the Starship Enterprise, and this series debuted in 1966. It only ran for 3 seasons on NBC. Well, tonight, an old friend of 93 WIBC, Stephen Shoet, joins us from Los Angeles to give us a little unknown history of this very unique show. Stephen, thanks for taking time of your schedule to join us this evening. How are you?
Well, great, and thanks for having me, Denny.
You bet. Now, you have written this book, The Hollywood Stories, and in it are these anecdotes that follow a lot of this. But this Star Trek thing is really sort of cool. How did Star Trek come to be?
Yeah, well, I do have a lot of anecdotes about Star Trek in my book, and it was Gene Roddenberry made a show, a very good show, I thought. It was called The Lieutenant back in 1963. I mean, I didn't see it then, but I saw it afterwards, and it was about the Marine Corps, and he tried to tackle some controversial subjects on the show, and the feedback he got from the Pentagon was not always positive, and even though it was well recognized, NBC didn't want to go on with the show, so they canceled it. So later on, Roddenberry was at a Dodger game, and he was talking to a writer friend and said that he wanted to make a show sort of like a wagon train, a 19th century show, but he wanted to have different races or different people representing different races traveling together and encountering adventures.
Wagon Train was one of my favorite shows. Had Ward Bond as the wagon master. So they wanted to do something like this, only in the future.
Well, yeah. No, he wanted to do it in the past.
Oh, in the past. Okay.
Yeah, and by the way, Ward Bond's one of my favorite characters.
Isn't he the greatest?
So many funny stories about Ward Bond, but anyway, the friend sort of innocuously said that different races traveling together. Come on, Gene, that wouldn't happen for 300 years, and that's what gave him the idea to set the show in the future. And originally, he was going around calling it Wagon Train to the Stars, and it later became known as Star Trek.
Now that's pretty cool. Now there was this anecdote about this L.A. police chief influence. The creation. What was that? The creation of one of the main characters was by this L.A. police chief. What was that all about?
Well, Gene Roddenberry was a former police officer, and he served under Chief William Parker. And if people saw the movie Changeling with Angelina Jolie, the LAPD had a history of being considered probably unfairly corrupt. And when Chief Parker came in, he said, "I'm going to clean up the force," and he did things like he worked with the producers of the TV show Dragnet to show the public how hard the police officers worked on solving cases. He required people to ride in patrol cars so they wouldn't walk the beat, so they wouldn't get tempted with what went on in the streets. He is the person who the phrase "the thin blue line" is attributed to, meaning the police were the only people who stood between civilization and anarchy. So under his watch, the LAPD began to go up in respect, but he was considered kind of a cold fish, very logical, very taciturn. And there was one time he was giving an interview, and somebody asked him about police brutality, and he gave the interviewer a cold look, and he said, "Listen, I can only hire humans, and as long as I can only hire humans, we're going to have human problems." And he was the main basis for Gene Roddenberry's creation of Mr. Spock.
This is great. Joining me this evening, Stephen Shoet. He has written a book, Hollywood Stories, short, entertaining anecdotes about stars and legends of the movies. We'll tell you how to find that a little bit later, but he's joined us in the past. Now, the original cast from 66 to 69, they featured William Shatner as Captain James Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, DeForest Kelley as Dr. Leonard McCoy, like they called him Bones, James Doohan, who is everybody's favorite, Scotty, and Nichelle Nichols as Uhura, George Takei as Hikura Sulu, and Walter Koenig as Pavel Chekhov. What lengths was Leonard Nimoy really willing to go to hold those ears where they had to hold them? That was what the big thing was, Spock's ears.
Yeah, causing him a great deal of initial pain, causing him to play the character with dignity, even though you think before that show's on the air and people don't know who Mr. Spock is. He's standing behind the camera waiting, and the Teamsters are making fun of him, like, "Hey, what are you supposed to be, man?" But he was really into the character, but it did cause him a great deal of physical pain. And he went to one of the producers of the show and he said, "I can't take this. What can I do?" And the producer said, I've got something for you. There's a Beverly Hills plastic surgeon, and he can do an operation, make your ears actually pointed. Then when you're off the show in a couple of years, he can redo them and make them normal." And Leonard Nimoy...
No way.
He said, "Let's go, let's go." And he was running to the car, and the producer was really embarrassed, and Leonard Nimoy turned and he said, "Oh, you blankety blank. Oh, you had me going, you blankety blank." But he was really going to do it.
Wow. So were those just prosthetic devices that fit over his ears? I always assumed they were just, rubber and putty. What was it that was fitting over his ear?
Yeah, as far as I know, prosthetic devices, and people, I guess different people did them differently. In fact, he talked about that when he was in the recent movie, that there's no one way of doing it with the ears. So I guess he got used to them after a while, or was willing to, willing to go along with it. But it was a difficult thing. He had a lot of things that were difficult, as far as bringing that character to life, not just the ears. One of the things was the William Parker influence at first. At the very beginning of the show was not actually Mr. Spock. It was this character called Number One, which was a female first officer played by Majel Barrett. She was originally supposed to be the unemotional one. And then Nimoy was told by a director that you're playing the role too emotionally and you need to tone it down. And at the same time, the network didn't like Majel Barrett, even though she would later marry Gene Roddenberry. So she was jettisoned from the show, and they weren't too fond of the satanic-looking Spock. But Nimoy developed that character over time to get the unemotional aspects into the character. And there's a lot of stuff to that, actually. This was in the middle of my high school years. I graduated in 70, and we had this thing going through high school at the time that Martin Landau was originally going to play the role of Spock, but he declined it. Was that true? Did Leonard Nimoy, was he second choice? I'll tell you what, it depends on who you talk to. There's a story that it was going to be Martin Landau. There's a story that was going to be Michael Dunn, the little man who played Dr. Wainless on The Wild Wild West. There's a story that it was going to be DeForest Kelley.
Well, DeForest Kelley was the Bones. He was the doctor.
Right, but he said that he was offered Spock at first. Actually, Nichelle Nichols, when she came in to read, the character of Uhura had not been created, and she actually read for Spock. And she said that after her reading, she was so good that the producer said, "Let's see if Leonard Nimoy has signed a contract yet." They were thinking about making Spock female, or at least they told her that. So there were different versions, but there is another version by some of the producers that it was only Leonard Nimoy was the only one who was considered. So it's one of those things. Star Trek has a little bit of lore. It depends on who you talk to sometimes.
There was this connection between Landau and Nimoy, if I remember right. Leonard Nimoy, who did accept the part of Spock, later took over the role of the disguise expert on Mission Impossible. If you remember, Landau left that show, and Spock was the disguise expert. But how did Spock change? Now, Jeffrey Hunter came in. Now, Jeffrey Hunter was a great cowboy character, and then he replaced William Shatner. How did Spock change after Hunter came in?
I think that's the other way around.
Other way around. I'm sorry, you're right.
Yeah. Well. See, here was the thing. When Leonard Nimoy was playing the role with Jeffrey Hunter, when he was Spock to Captain Pike, the Jeffrey Hunter character in the original pilot, The Cage, that they made, Leonard Nimoy felt that if he played the role low key, that the scenes would die, because Jeffrey Hunter was a very low-key actor and didn't have very much emotion that he was showing. And Leonard Nimoy was a stage actor, so he was sort of trained to show emotion anyway. Well, when William Shatner came in, he was a ball of fire. When he replaced Jeffrey Hunter, he had tons of energy. And so then Leonard Nimoy felt a lot more comfortable moving into that sort of taciturn state that Mr. Spock became famous for. So William Shatner's portrayal of Captain Kirk had a lot to do with Leonard Nimoy's ultimate discovering the characterization of Mr. Spock.
Well, it was 1966. I was a freshman in high school, and I remember that it was the first time I'd ever seen women in costumes like this. I grew up in a period of time when girls wore Oxford shirts and big blousy sweaters, and then all of a sudden we saw men in skin-tight garb, and we saw women in things that showed their figure. And for a freshman in high school, that was a unique thing to say. Joining me this evening is an expert on all of this with Star Trek. His name's Stephen Showhead. Stephen, that was pretty unique costume design back then, was it not?
Yeah, right. The little mini outfits and
yeah,
stuff.
little mini outfits.
Yeah, and when they made the movies, Nichelle Nichols was they sort of went unisex, and she was very unhappy about that.
Yeah, so were a lot of young testosterone-laden males.
Right.
All right, now let's talk about Lucille Ball. Desilu got involved with this, but what was the relationship between the series and Lucille Ball?
Well, first of all, Lucille Ball at that time with the Here's Lucy show over at CBS, they would give her extra money every year to develop some new shows, and nothing was implicit. She could have, or it was implicit that was the money for her, but nothing was required, I should say. She could have pocketed that money, but she decided to try and look for new shows, and so one of the shows that was pitched to her was Star Trek, and Star Trek had been turned down by a lot of different people because the sets every week of creating a new planet were cost prohibitive. Well, Lucille Ball, again, according to some people, thought that the show was about stars entertaining in the USO. The United Services Organization. So she once asked, "Well, how's that show coming about the stars in the South Seas, like Bob Hope?"
Oh no!
And she was told that no, it's a science fiction show. And she was also told that between that and this other show, Mission Impossible, that they would lose $65,000 for each episode, and she thought hard about it and said, I still want to do it. I still think it's an excellent idea, and it'll make a great show. And so if it wasn't for her, you might not have had Star Trek. Now, the lucky thing for her is that after the show was on the air a little bit, she managed to sell the Desilu company to Paramount and make quite a bit of money off of it. And later on, some people at Paramount said, well, why did we buy this again? It doesn't seem like a good investment at all. But, of course, Star Trek eventually took off in syndication and became one of Paramount's, probably their biggest franchise eventually.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. You know, Lucy was still one of the best. Elizabeth Taylor, Lucille Ball were two of the best financial minds that ever hit Hollywood from the women's side. They were just terrific, and I guess she really proved that.
Right.
Hey, there was we've got a call here. And by the way, folks, if you've got a call or if you've got a question for Stephen Showhead, give us a call, 239-9393. It's 1-800-571-9422. If you've got a Verizon cell phone, it's pound 9393. We're talking about Star Trek. It started 45 years ago, back in 1966. And, Stephen, we've got a caller here. His name's Bo. Hey, Bo, how are you?
Hey, Denny.
All right.
How are you?
My question is, back when they showed the episode of Kirk and Uhura kissing.
Oh, it was the first interracial kiss. Bo, yes, you remember.
Yeah. I do remember, and I was wondering that there was reports of death threats, that if it was aired, that there'd be death threats, and that there were some stars on the show that actually had a big issue with it. Any truth to that?
Well, not that I know of about death threats. They were afraid of stuff like that, and they didn't show it in some places in the South. But according to Nichelle Nichols, the only letter they got was a man in the South, and he said, "I'm against the mixing of the races, but when a a young man like Captain Kirk has a beautiful babe like Lieutenant Uhura in his arms, what's he supposed to do?
That's exactly right.
The thing was, it was supposed to be Spock actually, and Uhura, and then William Shatner said, if anybody gets to kiss her, it's me. And what happened was they filmed it two ways. And the first way they did it with the kissing, although they were forced to kiss by the aliens that they were encountering. But the second way they didn't kiss, but Shatner kept saying inappropriate lines, so they couldn't use the second scene, or he'd cross his eyes or mess things up, and so they were forced to use the scene where they actually kissed.
That's pretty good. Now, Nichelle Nichols, didn't she end up working for NASA? I somehow remember
she did, yeah.
What did she do? I knew that one of them went on to work for NASA.
Yeah, I don't want to say all the I don't want to get this wrong and give you all the details.
Okay.
I'm not a total expert of everything she did for NASA. I know she did a lot of work for them, and she really seems like a wonderful lady. I'll tell you, if you watch the Lieutenant, you can watch the early episodes on YouTube. She was just a great actress. I mean, and of course, it was very disappointing for her not to get to do much more on Star Trek, but it just always seemed to go to Kirk and McCoy and Mr. Spock.
Yeah, that's just the way things went down. Our number is 239-9393, 1-800-571-9422. Joining us now is Kevin from Broad Ripple. Hey, Kevin, how are you?
I'm great. Sixth grade, I'm running home, St. Philip Neri, to watch Laugh-In and, of course, Star Trek, and you'd see the same actors walk around the corner and be on Bonanza, so it was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Great.
Now, how old were you back then, Kevin?
Well, I was 10, 12 at the most.
Yeah, that's...
And
go ahead.
The greatest episode, I thought, was the episode where Frank Borsch and the other fellow had black and white on each side of the face, but it was different sides, and they fought to the death. And I thought that was a very good social lesson for everybody at the time.
You know what? There were so many cutting-edge things that they did, Stephen. The other thing that I remember is that for whatever reason, I can't remember whether it was the second season or the third season, they got the death slot, which was Friday evening. And I can
Friday at 10.
Friday at 10, and I was a nerd. And I can remember I think that was my sophomore year. If we didn't have a home football game or whatever, or a home basketball game, I stayed home and I watched. I didn't go out. I was a nerd. I enjoyed watching them. What was the first time slot? Was it Sunday evening for them? The first one?
Oh gosh, I think it was on Monday.
Maybe it was Monday.
I think it was Monday. And by the way, just Nichelle Nichols was hired to recruit minorities and female personnel for NASA.
For NASA, yeah.
Wanted to get that right
before
I said it. Yeah, and it was too bad about the bad time slot. I mean, that not only did they get the bad time slot, but by the third season, the network really wasn't committed to the best writers anymore. They really weren't committed to the best guest stars. So it really was a show that was in the death throes, and by that point. And one of the things was that again, going back to the Lieutenant, if you did this social commentary with the modern background, you might get flack for it. But if you set things in the future and call it the Federation rather than the military, you're a lot freer to make this kind of commentary that they made in the episode that the gentleman mentioned, and talk about things like racial division and things like that, and not get that kind of feedback when you make it an allegory.
I think that you're exactly right. We had Nichelle, who was the lieutenant. We had a Russian. We had somebody of Oriental. That was a very star-studded cast, but it was very broad-brushed, and we didn't see that much in the '60s.
And you know what? I didn't notice it or care, really.
Nobody
just cared
did.
About the good stories, friendship. Like, I wasn't even thinking about, like, this one's this race and this one's that race. They're just Sulu and Uhura and Captain Kirk to me. I guess it's a big deal to some people, but it was pretty immaterial to me, personally.
There was this ongoing feud between Kirk and Spock. How did the other actors feel about Shatner?
Well, obviously they've stated bad things. I mean, I think they all liked him at first. I mean, Nichelle Nichols was in a car accident the first day she was there, and she barely could make it through work. And Shatner stopped shooting and drove her home, and I think she always appreciated that. And there was just this thing where Shatner had to remember so many lines, and was so into making sure that the Kirk character was front and center, and there were at times when he would say, well, does Mr. Sulu have to have this line? Can't the captain figure that out for himself? Or does Uhura have to have this line? And of course the other actors resented it. And even Leonard Nimoy felt that the captain had become too much of a problem solver. But the thing was, you could look at it from the other point of view, like DeForest Kelley did, that William Shatner was such a hard worker, and his energy level was keeping the show alive to a certain extent. So, and the other people, of course, were not under contract. They were day players compared to Shatner and Nimoy, who had a long-term contract where they're expected to be there for every show. So they had more at stake. So it depends on how you look at it, but there certainly was resentment from the other four characters. I mean, they all wrote books which basically said that they did not like Shatner. In fact, James Doohan had the line, "I love Captain Kirk, but I can't stand William Shatner."
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
Boy, if that's not radio, I don't know what is. 45 years ago, Star Trek began, and as Bo said earlier, our geek flags are flying broadly. And on the phone with me here tonight is Stephen Showett from Hollywood. He's written a book called Hollywood Stories, and it's a lot of very entertaining anecdotes about the legends and the stars. We'll tell you how to find that a little bit later. Stephen, there was a very famous television parody that John Belushi did of William Shatner's Captain Kirk. How did it was hilarious. I still remember seeing that. But how did the folks from Star Trek react to it?
Well, what happened was it was right when they were making the Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan in 1982. John Belushi actually showed up on the set. He happened to be on the Paramount lot, and unfortunately he was close to death at that time, although nobody knew it. But anyway, he walked up to DeForest Kelley and said, I did a parody of Captain Kirk, and I'd love to show it to you. And DeForest Kelley was kind of reclusive, except when he showed up at Star Trek conventions. He hadn't seen it, but he was a gracious man. Now, normally, he was the one member of the cast who did not like to say anything bad about Shatner, was in his corner, would never put him down, but he was curious. He had heard about the skit. So he went to Belushi's dressing room and watched the video and was just in awe of the job Belushi did, capturing all the pauses, which by the way, William Shatner always said the reason he had those pauses in his acting was because half the time he couldn't remember his lines.
I thought,
so that's why he did that. But anyway, for the rest of the day, Shatner was really annoyed at DeForest Kelley because Kelley was so professional usually, and he kept looking at Shatner and just breaking up.
Yeah, well, what I remember about Belushi was he'd do the eyebrow things. One eyebrow would go up, and then the other eyebrow would go up, and then he'd do those pregnant pauses. But it was hilarious. That showed up on Saturday Night Live. And you're right. Didn't he die within a year after that? It was
a year after the meeting with DeForest Kelley, and when he was doing the routine for Saturday Night Live, I mean during the week they thought about canceling it because of course he didn't look like William Shatner and he just couldn't get it down, but he kept at it and kept at it, and it probably was his most proud moment on that show.
Oh, that's terrific. Hey, we've got a couple more callers. Let's see if we can get to them. Brian joins us from Coatesville. Hey, Brian, how are you?
Hey, boss. How you doing?
I'm doing well. All right, you got some questions for Stephen?
Well, no, just a couple comments about the quality of the shows back then.
Okay.
You know what I mean? And it's what I was born in '75, so I got to see those are on the reruns on the after shows.
Okay.
I got to be in the movie and everything else, but that intro does it all.
Yes,
it really does, and it's that whole thing that's and like you said about the spaceship. How many different people from all over the world are on the spaceship?
You know what? That is absolutely true. Now, let's talk about that just a little bit, Stephen. When the show was canceled, the Paramount Studios hoped to recoup its production losses by selling the syndication rights to the show. They had no idea. It didn't really make money until after it was canceled.
Right, after Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, and the Apollo 11 crew landed on the moon, that's when it really took off in syndication, and it's such a fascinating thing. Like one of the stories I have in my book is about how Charlie Chaplin was so famous. And yet he was unrecognized walking down the street because he didn't have the mustache. And at the height of his fame, he entered a Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest, and he lost. And the reason I bring that up is because I think Walter Koenig was the exact opposite of that. He was recognized wherever he went. Everybody would yell out, Chekhov, Chekhov, and
Pavel
he said
Chekhov.
he couldn't pay his groceries.
You know.
So it was an amazing situation that the actors found themselves in, and the one who really made an acting career for himself was Leonard Nimoy, who, like you said, got on to Mission Impossible. Leonard Nimoy always admired Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces, so playing the role of Paris was initially very attractive to him, and he kept working. But the other one struggled, including a broke, divorce, living in the trailer with his Doberman, William Shatner.
Oh, my gosh. Oh, we got another call here. Let's see if we can grab this one. This is from the southern part of Indianapolis, Stephen. It's in Greenwood, and a fellow by the name of Mark is joining us. Hi, Mark.
Yes, but this is most illogical, Jim.
Yeah. All right. What is your question, or what do you have to share with us, Mark?
Question. Do you know of any NASA astronauts who were fans of Star Trek?
Yes, you had Mae C. Jemison. She actually appeared on Star Trek: The Next Generation, and then Buzz Aldrin and Alan Bean were part of the 40th anniversary. So yes, and I'm sure there are other ones as well.
Yeah, there were a lot of guys that really liked. Well, it's my understanding from my brother Tom that they liked that show. The guys in Vietnam, whenever they got a chance, they were always interested in Star Trek. I find that really kind of crazy. We've got Peter up next here. Hey, Peter, how are you?
Hey, good evening. How are you this evening?
Good. Do you have something for Stephen?
Hey, listen, Stephen. I'm a lifelong, unashamed, middle-aged now Trekkie geek. Was introduced to Trek during its initial syndication runs of the early 70s. I am also an evangelical, fundamentalist, born-again Christian type, and thought it was interesting how Roddenberry, despite being a secular humanist in his philosophy, as I understand, how Star Trek touched on the spiritual. And I'm not talking about the all-encompassing generic God thing. So many of the points seem to have a specifically Judeo-Christian emphasis.
Yeah.
Bread and Circuses, where they talked about the civilization having both Caesar and Christ. Who Mourns for Adonis, where Apollo talks about worshiping the gods of old, to which Kirk responds, no, we find the one quite sufficient.
Hey, Peter, you really are a geek, aren't you?
I really am.
You got it down, man. This is good. Well, let's let Stephen respond to that. Stephen, what do you think? There was a spirituality underneath all of this.
Yeah, Roddenberry was an atheist, but I think it didn't always. The show didn't always go the way he wanted it to go. I think they did have Judeo-Christian values, and maybe that was interjected more by the network folk than Roddenberry himself. And also, I think that the fact that Captain Kirk would really use gunboat diplomacy to solve everything, or at least solve a lot of things, and use force, I don't think that was Roddenberry's initial intent either. I think he would have rather done it with reason, more like Captain Picard tended to do, but the network found that boring, and that's why they rejected the initial episode, or one of the reasons why they rejected the initial episode, The Cage. So I don't think Roddenberry's philosophy about life always came through. And of course, he was also a practical man. You know, a quick story about him. Star Trek fans probably already know this, but he wrote lyrics to the Star Trek theme because he figured that the show might not make me any money. I'm going to have to make money somehow, and that way he got half the royalties on Alexander Courage's music.
I didn't know that.
Alexander Courage was not too happy about that.
I did not know that. Now, how much input did guys like Shatner or DeForest Kelley or Leonard Nimoy, how much input into the script did those guys have? Did they have any?
Yeah, Leonard Nimoy had a lot, and so did Shatner. I mean, Leonard Nimoy really created Mr. Spock's persona in a lot of ways. Like for example, the Vulcan neck pinch. The reason Leonard Nimoy created that was because he didn't want to be fighting and possibly getting hurt. So
we're all nerds. So he wanted to have a special grip. I remember that.
Right.
Oh,
yeah, that was one thing. And Shatner, see, like if you go back to like a show like MASH, one of the things they did on that show was they always let the actors direct because they figured the new directors coming in would the actors might run roughshod over them, so might as well let the actors direct. Well, on Star Trek they didn't do that, and William Shatner pretty much did run roughshod and demand more lines for himself and things like that. So he had a lot of impact on the way the finished scripts went, especially because he was required to learn the lion's share of the dialogue.
Boy, there was a lot of digestion of script. Man, he just did so much. 93 WIBC, my name's Denny Smith. An old friend of 93 WIBC, Stephen Showett, joins us from Hollywood, and we're talking Star Trek, which started 45 years ago. There was a follow-up with movies as the show went into syndication. Then we had The Wrath of Khan. How did this director, Nicholas Meyer, get this performance out of Shatner? What did he do? He must have done something special to get that out of him.
Well, you know, when they made the first movie in 1979, the whole idea was to sort of hide the aging of the actors with different lighting and things like that. And Shatner had lost a lot of weight to do that movie. And even though that movie made a lot of money, the motion picture was kind of a creative disappointment. So when they made the movie in '82, The Wrath of Khan, they decided to deal with the aging of the actors. And William Shatner was initially reluctant about that, reluctant about having a son in the movie.
Now, he was an admiral. He was Admiral Kirk at that point, was he not?
Right.
Okay.
The whole idea was off-putting to him, and he was. He also was surrounded by advisors that are saying this might not be good for your career. You won't get any leading men roles anymore. So what would happen was he would do the scenes with sort of leading man bigger than life energy, and Nicholas Meyer kept ordering retake after retake after retake until Shatner would just throw the line away and stop acting and just start being. And it's like a lot of times it was like the 12th or 13th take that when Shatner got kind of tired, that was the one that ended up being used in the final product with The Wrath of Khan.
That's pretty cagey when you think about it.
Right.
So he really didn't sit down and say, this is what I want. He just sort of wore him out and got what he wanted anyway.
Right. Because, I mean, there's a certain amount of protectiveness, especially after you play characters for that long, and Nicholas Meyer was coming into the world respected but new, having directed a TV show. By the way, when William Shatner was asked years later who was the best director of Star Trek ever, he did say Nicholas Meyer, so there was appreciation.
I'll be darned. All right, now we've got a call from James, and I've got this same question. James, fire away. What have you got? James?
When they did hello?
There we go. I got you now.
All right. I was wondering, when they did the reboot with J.J. Abrams, did any of the original cast have anything to say about it? Were they happy with it? Were they upset?
Oh, that's good.
Shatner's upset because he wasn't in it. In fact, he made Nimoy promise that they never discuss it again. Obviously, Nimoy was very happy with it. Nichelle Nichols seems to be very happy with it, got along very well with Zoe Zadania. Walter Koenig met I forget the name of the young actor who played Chekhov, but they got along well. John Cho and George Takei went out to dinner and had long discussions about Sulu. So yeah, the living actors got along well with their replacements.
What was your favorite of all of them, Stephen? Both the
one.
movies. The 2009 one.
Loved it.
You don't? Okay. Is there going to be another one after that?
There is, yeah. And it's either 2012 or 2013.
Which one did Leonard Nimoy direct? I know that he directed one of them.
He directed number 2 and number 3 and number 4. And originally they didn't want to hire him for number 3. They being Paramount Studios, Michael Eisner, because Michael Eisner had thought that Leonard Nimoy wanted Spock killed, and Leonard Nimoy had taken the role in Star Trek II to do a good death scene, but he never required Spock to be killed. He wrote a book called I'm Not Spock, and that didn't go over well with fans, and it came back to hurt him a little bit later, but he ended up getting the directing job after all.
Stephen, your day job is one of a tour director. What is your normal day like?
Well, we give tours. I give tours around Hollywood and other areas around L.A., and people can find out about it at HollywoodStories.com. And I've collected thousands of stories, and that led to me writing the book, Hollywood Stories, Short, Entertaining Anecdotes About the Stars and Legends of the Movies. And that's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and people can also find out about that at HollywoodStories.com. It's a great Christmas gift, by the way.
If people come out to Hollywood, can they track you down as one of the tour?
Absolutely.
All right, how do they? If I ever come to Hollywood, I'm going to find you, rascal, because HollywoodStories.com for all the information. Really? All right. Well, listen, you've been an absolute pro for us. I so appreciate you, and thanks for staying in touch by email. It's always nice to hear from you. We will talk again, I promise. Now, folks, you need to know this book is not some thin little paperback book. This is a heck of a book. How many pages is this, Stephen?
About 312 pages, and it's packed. It's over 1,000 stories about movies, television shows, producers, directors, a whole chapter on Walt Disney, just really fun stuff.
The thing that kills me about you, Stephen Showett, is that you remember it all. It's not just that you wrote it, you've got it all in your memory. Thank you so much for joining us, Stephen.
You got it.
All right, you take care. Well, there you go, folks. Stephen Showett, all the way from Hollywood. We'll have him back. He is just a hoot.